So Matthew's gospel comes to the very heart of what he's wanting to say, this passage that we're looking at here. All the way through Matthew, he's been quoting Old Testament prophecies that Jesus is fulfilling this, he's fulfilling that, he's fulfilling the other. And now the culmination is coming, that Jesus is fulfilling the pinnacle of the prophecies that he's fulfilling here in his crucifixion. Jesus has already been mentioning a number of times to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and he must be betrayed and he must be killed, but he must rise from the dead again. So the whole of what Matthew's gospel really is coming towards this point, and really the cross of Christ is the pinnacle, the central point for the whole of human history. It's the focal point of God's plan and salvation. And what we look at now in tonight's passage is we see perhaps the sharpest distinction between God's character and God's love and the wickedness of the human heart in all its different forms, regardless of where you are in society. But we see something of the darkness of the human heart, but something of the glory of the love of God. Matthew focuses, he doesn't really say a lot about the crucifixion and what it involves. He almost skirts over it. He just simply says, and when they'd crucified him. He doesn't go in particularly into the agony. But what he does do is he focuses, he brings out different people's response to Jesus' crucifixion. And that's a challenge for us, isn't it? And a challenge for the whole world, is what is our response to the crucifixion of Christ? You know, there have been a number of attempts on Jesus' life. When he was but a toddler, Herod tried to kill him. He had to run away and go to Egypt. We read that when he comes out from being tempted in the desert by the devil, and he goes to Nazareth and he reads from the scriptures and reads Isaiah 61 and declares that today it's fulfilled in him. They want to say the same things as the chief priests. They're screaming blasphemy, really, in their hearts. And they drive him up to the cliff edge and try to throw him off, but he walks through them. We read for a couple of attempts in John's Gospel that the Jews are so enraged by him that they're picking up stones ready to stone him to death. But the point was, it wasn't Jesus' time to die. You know, that's a great comfort for us. You know that God, He knows. He knew when we were going to be born, and He also knows when we're going to die. If He's got stuff for us to do on this earth, we're kind of bulletproof in some ways. God will keep us alive for as long as He wants us to do the things that He's got. And this was particularly true with Jesus, was that God was no way going to let the enemy come in and to take Jesus' life prematurely. Jesus had to fulfill everything, and we've seen that as He's come with the Last Supper and everything. The fulfillment of the perfect timing of when He was going to die to fulfill all these prophecies. That Jesus was coming to die in God's particular and perfect timing, because this is the only plan of salvation. If this failed, we'd all be going to hell. But it didn't fail, because it's God's plan, and God never fails. So this part of the crucifixion, we're going to look next week about Jesus dying, or whenever we come back to it. I think we're off next week. But this part of the crucifixion is looking really about the Jesus' pain as a man. And we must never forget that yes, Jesus is, this is the miracle, is the only person who ever was, never will be, fully God. But yet, God took on our humanity, everything about it, not just like some body, although He did take a body on, but everything that makes us human. Our emotions, our wills, the whole thing. And we must never forget that Jesus Christ became fully man. So when we're reading, when we're thinking about what He went through, he went through that as a man, just like any other human being. The things that we would feel in that situation, he felt. You see, up to this point, Jesus has had a sleepless night. He'd had a trial before the Jews. He'd been falsely accused. He'd been slandered. He'd been spat upon. He'd been struck. He'd had a trial before Pilate. He'd had a trial before Herod, and Herod's soldiers had mocked him. He'd been punished with the whip by Pilate. As we come on now, he's been mocked by the soldiers. He's about to be scourged, which is the whipping that they do before a crucifixion, which some people didn't even get through that before they were taken to the cross. And then he was about to be led out to be crucified. So let's look at some of the characters involved. Firstly, verse 27, it talks about the soldiers. We'd seen already, as just alluded to there, that Jesus had been flogged as a punishment before the main scourging of his actual crucifixion. And as we read in John last time, they dress him up as a king to mock him. It says, Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So basically saying, look, surely, this king is no threat to Rome, is he? He's no threat to you guys either. Surely we can let him go. Behold the man. It says in verse 27 that in their mocking of Jesus, they got the whole battalion there. Different commentators reckon different numbers. It could be from 120 soldiers up to 600 soldiers stood around mocking him. The might of Rome, the might of the Gentiles mocking Jesus, the King of the Jews. These soldiers were just following orders in some way, but you get to see a glimpse into their hearts. Evil's often restrained just because we don't have the power to exercise it. There's something very frightening when God lifts the restraints off and puts people into a position of power just to see what really comes out of their heart. Often people are held back because of laws and different things, and that's why we need to pray for our government so that we have good, godly laws that they suppress evil in a sense. But when the law's lifted off, it shows the true nature of someone's heart. For a genuine believer in Christ, when the law is lifted off, it doesn't make any difference. They'll live in the same, whether there's a threat from the authorities or not, because they want to do what's right before God, because God's given them a new heart and a desire to do what's right before him. But in the heart of a wicked person, someone who's not been transformed, someone who's still got their original heart in a sense, who hasn't got the new heart that Christ gives us in the gospel, when those restraints are lifted from us, we start to see the true nature of evil that comes out. And what measure of evil we see from these guys, they're just playing with Jesus, cruelly playing with Jesus. In fact, they were notorious, the Romans, the soldiers, for doing this, that they would dress up condemned prisoners. They'd even have some games where they almost had like giant chess pieces and played them with the victims while they were stood there mocking them, ridiculing them. It says they dressed him in a scarlet robe. In the other Gospels it talks about a purple robe. It was probably one of the robes that the soldiers wore themselves. I don't think we should get too hung up about the difference in colour, because sometimes someone might say it's greeny yellow, someone might say it's yellowy green. But the point is that what they were trying to do was they were trying to mock him by putting on a purple garment which a king would wear. They put on the crown of thorns, probably to make him look like Caesar. They do later on kneel down and salute him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," as if to say, probably in a mocking way, like the way that they would hail Caesar. Hail the King of the Jews. They put a reed in his hand. You know, we looked last time about the scepter, saying the scepter had gone out from Israel. The scepter there is something that a monarch holds to say that they've got power and authority to rule and reign and make judgment. They're mocking him. They're basically saying, look, there you go, you try and rule. They're saying, look, compared to the might and the power of Rome, you're completely defenseless. You're nothing in our hands whatsoever. So God, as we looked last time, the scepter had truly been taken from Israel. But had the scepter been given to Rome in its place? In one sense, yes, it had. Rome were pulling the strings at this point. But we always need to realize this is why we're not to be too scared about anything that happens in the world. You know, we see nations doing this, nations doing that. You know, they may be in power for this time. But we've got to look higher up. Who's actually pulling the strings? Jesus knew that. That's why he could be at peace, because he knew that Rome weren't in control. They didn't hold the scepter, but he knew that his Father in heaven holds the scepter over the whole of human history. Nothing happens apart from his say-so. So they're there mocking him with this, and they even pick the stick up and start to hit him. They spit in his face, the ultimate sign of indignity. They took the reed and they struck him on the head. It says in John's Gospel that they came in and they punched him as well. You could imagine a group of fired up soldiers. Once one starts hitting him with a stick, the rest probably piled in and were punching him and slapping him. Mocking him in a sense, saying, King of the Jews, where's your power? Where is your power? Well, this same Jesus is described, the glorified Jesus, in Revelation chapter 19. It says, from his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down nations, and he will rule with a rod of iron. The Romans had no idea. They thought that they were the rod of iron, but they got it so wrong. Psalm 2 says, when it talks about the nations, mocking God in a sense and thinking that they're in control, it says that God sits in the heavens and laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. We need to remember that we've got a God in heaven who's completely in control. This was all part of Christ's plan to lay his life down, to become humble and obedient to death, even death on the cross. This is all part of God's wonderful plan of salvation. God went through this, Jesus went through this because he loves us. And it was the only way, the way he'd planned to actually save us and mean that we as human beings can be reconciled to God. So verse 31, they strip him of these royal robes and they put on his clothes. And it says in verse 31 that they led him away to crucify him. We read in John's Gospel that Jesus initially bears his own cross. But then presumably because of the mistreatment he's had, because of the sleepless night he's had, he can't physically carry his cross anymore. And we get this Simon of Cyrene coming in. Cyrene, a Roman province in Libya on the north coast of Africa. Probably a Jew who'd come for the festival, come to Passover. He was just walking through and suddenly he gets grabbed by the soldiers. Apparently there were 4 soldiers would accompany those who were being crucified. They'd take them up the street. We also read from the other gospel accounts that the 2 robbers who were to be crucified with him were part of the grouping as well. So Simon's just pulled off the street to carry Jesus' cross. And we read in Mark's account, he said that he was coming in from the country, so maybe he'd been staying at somewhere like Bethany, just a village outside Jerusalem, and was coming in to the festival, minding his own business. But Mark wonderfully says that he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. So at the time that Mark wrote his gospel, he's speaking about this Simon and his boys, as if he knows them, presumably as if they're part of the Christian community. We see something wonderful there with Simon, that he actually, we're told to take up our cross and follow Christ. But he actually literally took up Christ's cross. And from the wider evidence, it looks like he was saved as a result of carrying Jesus' cross. What a wonderful picture that is. In Luke's gospel, as we read earlier, that at this point, Jesus actually gives his last public address. There's a big crowd, mainly women, it seems, who were wailing and mourning because they knew what was going to happen to Jesus and they loved him. But he turns around and he says these words, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" So what's Jesus trying to say there to these women? So motherhood in a Jewish culture of the time, was the greatest blessing really to have children. But Jesus is turning it around and saying that there's going to be a time that's coming when not to have children will be the blessing rather than having children. He's basically saying there's something so bad is going to come that you wish you'd never had kids. You'll be blessed if you've never had kids at that point. And the bit there about the green wood. If they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? There's a reference there really to the might of the Romans. With the wood green, it's a picture of Jesus, that he's innocent, he's still alive, he's still living in God's sight, but yet God was choosing to punish him for a particular reason. We know the reason why. But he was choosing to punish him at this point through the Romans. But what Jesus is saying is that if the Romans can do this to this innocent man, how much more will God use the Romans to punish that which is dry? If you're trying to set fire to something, you try and light green wood, trust me, you've got to get it pretty hot to get it to burn. But if the wood's dry, it doesn't take a lot to get a roaring fire. So there's a lesson in here about that of, there were many in the situation there who were probably condemning Jesus and sort of, they were laughing at him and mocking him because of what God was doing to him through the Romans. But Jesus is basically saying, watch out, because you are actually sinful and God's judgment will come upon you, and how quickly it's going to come. It's a reference really in the immediate to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, when the Romans come in and they completely and utterly destroy the temple. They burn the whole temple complex. They burn much of the city. And the majority of Jerusalem's inhabitants are slaughtered. That's why it's blessed. You're blessed if you've never had kids, because the horrors of what the Romans did on the Jews at that time. And it was so decisive that that temple has never been rebuilt 2,000 years later. They've never offered a sacrifice on the Temple Mount for 2,000 years because of what Jesus had said at this time. So anyway, that's the last address that he says publicly to a crowd. And then they lead him to Golgotha, verse 33, which in Aramaic means place of a skull. The Latin word Calvaria, which is Latin for skull, which is where we get the name Calvary. People often talk about Christ's cross of Calvary. It's the same word. It's basically the cross of Golgotha. The place of the skull may be called that because it was the place where they killed people. Maybe it was called that because it was the place where there were a number of tombs where they buried people after having killed them. Or some believe that there's something about the place that looks like a skull. So if you've ever been to Jerusalem and on a tour around Jerusalem, they'll take you to near the bus station. And there's this limestone cliff. And the way it's been weathered and eroded, it looks like there's two eye sockets and like another one there, which probably where the nose was. It looks from a distance like a skull. Anyway, we don't know. That's probably hearsay. But they took him to Golgotha, to the place of the skull. And before nailing him, they offer him wine mixed with gall. Mark identifies the gall. Gall just literally means it's a sense of something bitter. It was wine with a bitter product in it. Mark identifies the bitter product as myrrh, which is a sedative. Now, I don't think the Romans were offering their victims sedatives to try and make the operation a bit more palatable. Apparently, and horrifically, they would offer them sedatives so that when they're nailing in the nails, they'd keep a bit stiller for the next ones to come. Some people possibly would have tried to come and offer such victims sedatives, reaching out with sticks with something on so they can just get a taste of something. But I don't think the Romans would be doing it to take away the pain. The whole thing of crucifixion was to make it as painful and as humiliating as possible. He was offered myrrh. One of the gifts from the wise men. Jesus knew that he was born for this time. This was part of his destiny. He knew that he had to go to the cross. And he says that he tasted it, but he wouldn't drink it. There's something there that Jesus knew full well, right from the beginning, what he had to face. But yet he didn't want to downplay anything. He didn't want anything that would take away from him drinking the cup. Remember when he wrestled in Gethsemane? Let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Jesus wanted to go through the whole thing fully conscious because he was fulfilling what his Father had asked him to do on our behalf. Verse 35, when they'd crucified him. The Jewish historian Josephus writes that in Israel at the time, in the first century, there were literally thousands of people who were crucified by the Romans. Most of them for insurrection, for rebellion. They were trying to, crush any attempt against their rule. They would crush violently. So there was nothing particular about this. This was just another Roman crucifixion. Obviously, Pilate knew it was different. But for the average man or woman or child on the street, this was just another Roman crucifixion. Stories are of the Romans that they like to experiment with different positions, different wood formations, just to try and see what was the most successful. Just delighting in people's misery and torture and watching people die at their power. You just see the wickedness of man. And like I say, in many situations, not every situation, but there's been many situations where, our brothers and sisters, Christians, have been tortured in such horrendous ways in the world, when people have been given a level of power, when the law is taken from them, and they've been given the go-ahead to go along with whatever's in their hearts. Some horrendous things have been done against God's people. So in Jesus' case, they probably nailed his hands and his feet. We know at least that he had nail marks in his hands from Thomas. You remember Thomas when he's doubting, he says, he wanted to see the nail marks. So we know at least he was nailed in his hands. So they'd probably been nailed in their hand and their foot and then hoisted up into position. Designed for maximum pain and maximum humiliation. the hanging victim would be suspended and would have difficulty breathing. So in order to try and breathe, they'd have to push up on the feet, which would cause more pain. And they'd only be able to do it so long as they could endure the pain, and then they'd have to drop again. And then they'd start to lose breath again, and they'd have to push up again. And then they'd repeat this until they succumbed to suffocation, basically, or the body just gave up because of the physical trauma that it's gone through. Mark's Gospel says that it was the 3rd hour when Jesus was crucified, which is 9 o'clock in the morning. So we can work out that before his death, he was hanging on the cross for 6 long hours. And yet, in the midst of it, still no sin, still a heart of love and compassion. In the midst of it, he's sorting out care for his mother. John 19, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, that's John, standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home. So he's even thinking about his mum's care when he's gone in that moment. But most strikingly, as Luke records, at this time Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." That's God's heart. He knows the wickedness of the human heart. He knows what they've done to him, the pain that he's going through, but yet he still wants to forgive them. How gracious and loving our God is. Verse 35, it says that they divided up his garments. Casting lots, which is a form of gambling, the Romans were dividing up his clothes. Apparently the normal Jewish man would wear sandals, an inner cloak, a headpiece, a belt, and then an outer cloak or tunic. So the soldiers seem to have divided up most of the parts, but then when they come to the outer tunic, they realize it was of one piece. And it was obviously, a good piece of clothing, good enough not just to rip up for rags. So they start to cast lots for the clothing. It says in John 19, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." This was to fulfill the scripture. And then John quotes from Psalm 22, which we read from before, written 1,000 years before the event. Even in that minute detail about Jesus' clothing, God knew. He knows everything. So they take his clothing and crucify him. Often when you see a crucifix, there's some kind of tastefully placed loincloth. But there's no reason to believe that he had anything like a loincloth. Part again of the humiliation. Jesus completely and utterly exposed for the whole world to see. But the thing is that with Christ completely and utterly exposed, when he's transparent, you can see right through him because he's sinless. And that's how we need to be before God. If we've got any hope of getting into heaven, we need to come to God completely naked in that sense, completely exposed, without hiding anything. You can't hide anything from God anyway. He knows the depths of our hearts. He knows what we've done. He knows what we think. But that's the way to come to Christ, is to come, realize that he laid down everything for us. And we need to come and be transparent before him and say, "Lord, search me. You know it all anyway. Look into me. I'm not hiding anything. You can't hide anything from God. The only way to get right with God is to recognize every single thing there, all the darkness, all the ugliness, all the wickedness, all the evil that can come out from us and has come out from us. To lay it before God. He can see it anyway. But this is the reason why Christ died in the first place, to take that from us, so that we can be forgiven and we can receive his life. The soldiers would have remained around, they're playing games. They had to stay around for two reasons, really: to stop people coming and trying to steal the people off the crosses, but also to stop them coming and, perhaps with a sword and putting them out of their misery. They wanted to make sure that they suffered. They wanted to make sure that people knew that no one messes with Rome. Above Jesus' cross there was the inscription, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Written there as a deterrent. Don't even think about stepping out of Rome's authority. John's account says that it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. Basically, so that every single person could see what was going on and could understand what was going on. And then verse 38 says that Jesus was crucified with two robbers. Two robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. In Isaiah 53 it says that Jesus was numbered with the transgressors. An allusion to this, that he's there crucified, surrounded by people who've transgressed, who've broken God's law. They'd also broken the law of Rome as well, which is why they were hanging there. But Jesus was there fulfilling that. And they knew that they'd done wrong, because they were both robbers. What's the definition of a robber? Well, Jesus uses the same word in this. I don't know if you can pick out what story he's talking about. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. The Good Samaritan was attacked by robbers. The same Greek word is used in a number of occasions in the Gospels. The question is that Jesus is hanging there as an innocent man, but is surrounded by robbers. They deserve to be there. But apart from these two, who were the real robbers in the story of the gospel? Matthew 21. Jesus said to them, "It's written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." Matthew 26. When he's there in Gethsemane, at the hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me?" John 10, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber." The true robbers in the situation are the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees, the one who were trying to steal the glory from God. We'd already seen Barabbas, one robber who'd been let off, and we're about to see another one. So that's Jesus' crucifixion. But what about the people surrounding the crucifixion? What are their responses? And what can we learn from that? The passers-by, says that they passed by and they wagged their heads at him. Again, quoting from Psalm 22. "All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him." If you look at verse 40, this is what they were saying. "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." So the people passing by were basically mocking him for his power, his supernatural power. Like, where's your power now? We read, according to Jewish custom, the fact that Jesus was crucified outside the city wall, outside the camp, was that according to the Old Testament law, anyone being executed, they couldn't be executed in the camp of Israel. They had to be taken outside of the camp or outside of the city for it to be done. That's why he was killed in that way. Also coupled with the fact that Jesus was seen as cursed. It says, cursed is anyone who's hanged on a tree. So they didn't want a cursed man to be in the camp. They had to remove him and get rid of him as a sign of, we're not allowing this evil into our camp. So Jesus is crucified outside the city wall. So there's many people passing by, particularly from the pilgrimage coming to Passover. How many of those people would have been from Galilee in particular? How many of those passers-by who were mocking Jesus now were part of the crowds who'd followed him around? Maybe they'd even sat there and eaten when Jesus fed the 5,000. Maybe some of them had even had a demon cast out from them. Maybe some of them had even been touched by Jesus and been healed. And yet they're there mocking him, saying, where's your power now? Why can't you get off the cross? Why can't you save yourself? We can look at that and say that's terrible. But to apply it to ourselves is how many people will follow Christ to a point when Christ is doing what they want him to do? When you're praying and God's answering and it's all going really well. But then in the point where God seemingly disappoints you, many people have left at that point and thought, well, I don't want to know. He's not doing it for me anymore. I don't want to know him. This is what the passers-by were doing. They were just there for their own interest. They were just blinded, looking at their own earthly needs, really. As long as Jesus is feeding us and he's healing us and he's setting us free from things, we're part of a big crowd and it's all going well, then yeah, we're going to follow. But what about when it turns? Many people will come to church because there's a big vibe going on and it's lots of people, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of things going on. What about when the church shrinks? What about when the church is persecuted? What about when the church is marginalized and mocked and ridiculed? Only the true believer in Christ will stay. All the others will be no better than the passers-by, mocking. It says in Hebrews that Jesus suffered outside the gate, that's outside the wall of the city, in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Just a wonderful picture there of how Christ is excluded from the camp so that we can be included into God's family. Everything that Jesus does here is laying things down as a sacrifice for us, as our substitute. The chief priests and the scribes, what's their attitude? They mocked him, verses 42 and 43. He saved others. He cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he desires him. For he said, I am the Son of God. So they too are mocking him and scorning him. The chief priests, when it comes to the wicked parties in the whole scene, we've seen the wickedness of the soldiers. We've seen the fickleness of the crowd and their wickedness and self-centeredness. But the true perpetrators are the religious people, the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees. They're the ones who are the source of this whole drama. People often will say, I don't want anything to do with religion because religion causes war. Does religion cause war? Well, no. Strictly speaking, it doesn't cause war. What causes war is our own pride and sinfulness. That's what causes war. Someone offends us and we want to get them back. And then because you've got them back, they want to get you back even more. Because they've got your back even more, you want to get them back even more than that. You see how it escalates and builds up? But it's the sin that causes war. But it seems to use religion very well to propagate. You know, there's something about rallying a cause. If people think that they can express their sinfulness in a sense and it be on God's behalf, then it kind of sanctifies that and gives it legitimacy. And they think, yeah, we're actually doing something for God. So religion is a dangerous thing. And, you know, we all need to be watchful of that, as we were looking at on Sunday about the book of James, is that we can often have lots of information, get lots of religion, but if it doesn't change our hearts, if it doesn't make us more like Jesus, if it doesn't make us as gentle and loving and patient and long-suffering, it will only be used as fuel in our arsenal, which will actually be destructive in someone else's life. The Pharisees and the scribes and that here, they thought they were on God's side. That was the problem. So when they expressed their sin, it was coming through like, he's blaspheming. Suddenly they could whip up a whole crowd because of this word blasphemy. And we see that in a lot of Muslim countries, really, against Christians. The word blasphemy, and suddenly the whole crowd is whipped up. Religion is a powerful force. We need to make sure that our religion is never just one of outward religion, just about accumulating knowledge, but it's always got to be that contrition of the heart. Where, you know, even when we read the Bible, we're not reading it for ammunition to get someone. We're reading the Bible because we want God to speak to us. We want God to change us. We want God to reveal Christ to us more so that we can bow down in greater measure and worship Him and praise Him. So they shout out, "Let Him come down now from the cross and we will believe in Him." Would they really believe in Him if He came down from the cross? They'd listened to His teaching, they'd seen the miracles, and yet they didn't believe. Jesus said to him, He said, "The only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah," and He talked about Him being resurrected from the dead. But even when He was resurrected from the dead, most of them didn't believe. That's how hard their hearts were against God. The soldiers, as we read in Luke's account, they come and mock Him as well at this point. Not only are they content to have mocked Him with the whole battalion, but they're mocking Him again. The soldiers mocked Him, coming up and offering Him sour wine and saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." They got an opportunity there just to deride Him. There's something perhaps earlier with the soldiers and their blindness to authority. They were in a political system that they were blind to, they didn't realize was actually controlling them. They thought they were doing good by serving their superior officers. And they thought they were good because they were serving their superior officers. But you've always got to look and see who's the actual ultimate superior officer. If the ultimate superior officer isn't God Himself, then you don't want to be coming under that structure, that hierarchy. And lastly, the robbers. Verse 44. The robbers who were crucified with Him also reviled Him in the same way. Why did they hate Jesus? Should have felt sorry for Him, if anything, that He was getting the same as them, but yet they could see that He didn't deserve it. Something about the human heart that naturally tends to hate Jesus. You'll speak to someone on the street and mention Jesus, and most people's reaction isn't one of, "Oh, can you tell me more about this Jesus?" It's one of repulsion. Something in the human heart that wants to push Jesus away. They don't, just by nature as human beings, we don't want to know. But especially when someone's been hurt. And we see these two men, we've described what crucifixion is like. We see these two men are in a position of hurt. And there's something in the nature of the heart of humans is that when we've been hurt, we want to hurt someone else. So even in their dying moments, they're wanting to hurt someone. And they're there, one on each side, reviling Jesus. He's the one in the middle. He's the only one, as they turn their head, they can probably see. They want to hurt him. They're both, all three of them really, in a living hell. Excruciating pain. You wouldn't be able to get any relief on the cross. It's not like you can just sort of have a sleep for an hour and sleep it off. But you're there in excruciating pain. You're conscious. The Romans had devised it in such a way that the pain wouldn't be so bad that you'd pass out, in a sense. You wouldn't just be unconscious all the time, but you'd be conscious through the process. You'd be thirsty. You're completely exposed. In the day, you'd be too hot and the sun would be burning you. In the night, you'd be too cold. You'd be shivering. They're in torment. When we read the Gospels and we think about Jesus' warnings about eternal torment, it's a fearful place to be. But for one of these men, his torment was about to end. Graciously, wonderfully, gloriously. His torment, that was going to be the last thing. Most of the other characters in the story were blinded to Jesus. They were blinded to the controlling factors upon their life. And it says that the devil himself blinds the minds of unbelievers. That they can't see who Jesus really is. They just naturally want to hate Jesus. They don't want anything to do with him. They don't want him to rule over them. But there's one man here whose eyes were opened. It says in Luke's Gospel, one of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ?" Just by the way he's saying the Christ, it probably means that these two men are Jewish, because they understood the concept of the Christ was to come, the Messiah was to come. Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him. So earlier on it says that both of them were reviling him. But then at one point, while this man's hanging on the cross, suddenly his eyes are opened and he starts to see Jesus in a different light. Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. He'd had his eyes opened to see that Jesus had done nothing wrong. He'd had his eyes opened, and it silenced him to realize that he himself had done wrong and did deserve punishment. That's what everyone needs to do in order to get right with God, is they've got to have their eyes open to see that, firstly, in a sense, the bad news, that we all stand condemned before God. We deserve punishment. But secondly, to see that Jesus is the one who's done nothing wrong. He gets to see him there as his substitute, as the one who's dying in his place. We see that Jesus is whipped and scourged so that by his stripes we might be healed. That Jesus, the innocent, is condemned so that we, the guilty, can go free. That Jesus wore the crown of thorns, had it pressed down into his head, so that we can wear a crown of glory. He was stripped and hung naked, so that we can wear garments of righteousness. He was mocked and reviled, so that we can be honored and blessed. He was numbered with the transgressors, so that we can be numbered with the saints. He was reckoned a sinner, so that we can be reckoned saints before God. He was reckoned unable to save himself so that he could save us to the uttermost. He died in disgrace so that we can be exalted and glorified forever. This man had had his eyes opened to see who he was, what he deserved, but to see who Jesus was and what Jesus was accomplishing. And because of that, Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." That man's suffering ended that day. It was going to be completely transformed. That's the wonder of the gospel. God takes the suffering and the pain of human existence, which, if the rebellion continues, will migrate into eternal torment. He takes that dark, bleak, horrifying picture, and through faith in him, he completely transforms it so that our pain and suffering ends. So we can be with him in a place where there's no more pain or suffering, no more tears, no more death. Nothing bad, but we can enjoy his presence forever. Today you will be with me in paradise. Let's pray.